I choose her. He turned down 20 beautiful women to marry, the one everyone ignored. The grand ballroom of the Ashford estate glittered with candlelight on that crisp October evening in 1823. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished mahogany floors, while servants in pristine livery glided between clusters of guests bearing silver trays of champagne and delicacies. The air hummed with nervous laughter and hushed whispers. 20 young women and 10 wealthy bachelors had gathered for what Boston society was already calling the matchmaking event of the decade. Charles Ashford, a prosperous merchant who had made his fortune in the fur trade, stood near the entrance greeting arrivals with practiced charm. This elaborate affair had been his idea, a calculated venture to forge profitable alliances between wealthy families and promising young women of good breeding. What most guests didn't know was that Ashford had a secondary motive. His niece, Penelope, now 24 and unmarried, needed what he delicately termed assistance in securing her future. Penelope Ashford sat in a cushioned alcove near the library doors, her voluminous lavender gown doing little to conceal her generous figure. She held a leather-bound book, History of the Expedition under the command of Captains Lewis and Clark. Though her eyes had stopped tracking the words 10 minutes ago, around her, young women in fashionable dresses of silk and taffeta preened and giggled, casting competitive glances at one another while attempting to appear demure and desirable. She had tried to refuse the invitation. "Uncle Charles, this is humiliating," she had pleaded 3 weeks prior. "Everyone will know why I'm there. They'll pity me or worse, mock me." Her uncle had patted her hand with well-meaning condescension. "Nonsense, my dear. You simply need the right gentleman to see past superficial concerns, a mature man of substance who values intelligence and character." What he meant, Penelope knew, was that he hoped some desperate or opportunistic bachelor might overlook her appearance in exchange for the dowry he was offering. The thought made her stomach twist with shame and anger. "Miss Ashford, you're not even trying," chirped Caroline Whitmore, the mayor's daughter, pausing beside the alcove with 2 other young women. Caroline was everything Penelope was not, slender as a willow branch, with golden curls and porcelain skin that had never seen a day of honest labor. "The gentlemen have arrived. You should at least pretend to be interested." "I am interested," Penelope replied evenly, holding up her book. "In Lewis and Clark's journey up the Missouri River. Did you know they traveled over 8,000 miles? Caroline's perfect nose wrinkled. "How dreadfully dull!" "Well, don't say I didn't try to help." She floated away in a cloud of rose perfume, her companions tittering. Penelope returned to her book, determined to endure the evening with what dignity she could muster. She would fulfill her uncle's wishes by attending, but she refused to humiliate herself further by competing for attention she would never receive. Across the ballroom, Marcus Dalton stood rigid as a lodgepole pine, his jaw clenched with barely suppressed irritation. At 32, he cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 3 inches of solid muscle, with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that brushed his collar, and pale gray eyes that seemed more accustomed to scanning distant horizons than ornate ballrooms. His formal attire, a black tailcoat, silk waistcoat, and starched cravat, fit him poorly, as though the clothes themselves recognized the absurdity of constraining a mountain man in gentleman's finery. "This is ridiculous, William," Marcus muttered to his business partner, who had essentially blackmailed him into attending. William Hartford, a portly gentleman 15 years Marcus's senior, smiled placidly. "Consider it an investment in our partnership. Charles Ashford controls half the fur trade routes in the territory. An evening of mild discomfort in exchange for his continued goodwill seems reasonable." "I'm a trapper and trader, not a performing bear," Marcus growled. "I don't belong here." "You're one of the wealthiest men in 3 territories," William corrected. "Your mountain credentials are precisely what makes you interesting to these people. They're bored with their own kind." Marcus doubted that. Already he'd been cornered by 3 different young women, each delivering rehearsed compliments about his adventurous spirit and rugged handsomeness, while their mothers hovered nearby like hawks circling prey. The attention felt predatory and hollow. These women didn't see him. They saw his bank accounts, his property deeds, his potential as a ticket to security and status. He'd built his fortune through 15 years of brutal work in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beaver in icy streams, negotiating with native tribes, surviving blizzards, grizzly bears, and claim jumpers. He'd lost 2 toes to frostbite and carried a scar from shoulder to ribs where a Blackfoot warrior's knife had nearly killed him. That life had been hard, but honest. This gilded circus felt like a lie wrapped in silk. "If you'll excuse me," Marcus said abruptly, "I need air." Before William could protest, Marcus strode toward the French doors leading to the veranda, ignoring the disappointed glances from several young women who had been maneuvering for an introduction. The October night was cool and clean, carrying the scent of falling leaves and distant wood smoke. Marcus drew a deep breath, feeling the knot in his chest loosen slightly. Above, stars pierced the darkness, the same stars he'd navigated by in the wilderness, though here they seemed diminished by the glow of the mansion's windows. He walked to the far end of the veranda, where shadows gathered beyond the reach of lamplight. That's when he noticed her, a young woman seated on a stone bench, absorbed in a book she held tilted toward the light spilling from the library windows. She hadn't noticed his approach. Her dark hair was pinned in an elaborate style that seemed at odds with her absorbed concentration, and her figure was generous in ways that current fashion pretended didn't exist. What struck Marcus most was her expression, complete, unself-conscious focus, as though she'd forgotten she was at a social event at all. "Good book?" She startled, nearly dropping the volume. When she looked up, Marcus saw intelligent brown eyes widened with surprise. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, her likely trying to place him oddly reluctant to break whatever spell had settled over this shadowed corner of the veranda. "Yes," she said finally, her voice low and slightly husky. "It's about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Are you interested in exploration?" The question surprised him. No one at this event had asked what he was interested in, only what he owned and whether he was married. "Very much," he admitted, moving closer. "I've followed some of their routes through the Rockies. Their journals undersold how difficult the terrain actually is." Her eyes lit with genuine interest. "You've been to the Rockies? The real wilderness?" "I've lived there for 15 years, Marcus said, settling onto the bench without asking permission. Somehow, it felt natural. "Made my living as a mountain man, trapping, trading, guiding the occasional expedition." "That's extraordinary," she breathed. "I've read everything I could find about the Western Territories, but I've never met anyone who actually—" She trailed off, seeming to catch herself. "Forgive me. I'm being rude. I'm Penelope Ashford. Marcus Dalton. He tilted his head curiously. Ashford, you're related to our host? A shadow crossed her face. His niece. He organized this event partly to help me find a husband. She said it bluntly, without self-pity, but with clear discomfort. I apologize for monopolizing the veranda. You probably came out here to escape all the matchmaking nonsense, and here I am, part of the very spectacle you're avoiding. On the contrary, Marcus said slowly, surprising himself with his honesty, you're the first person tonight who's talked to me like I'm a human being rather than a prize stallion. I was beginning to think everyone at this party had learned their lines from the same terrible script. Penelope laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that made something warm unfurl in Marcus's chest. I know exactly what you mean. Earlier, Caroline Whitmore told me I should be trying harder to attract attention. I asked her what she suggested, and she actually said, flutter your eyelashes and ask gentlemen to explain simple things to you. Men love feeling intelligent. Marcus snorted. That might explain why every conversation tonight has made me feel like I'm speaking to children. One young lady asked me to explain what a beaver looked like. Surely not. I'm not exaggerating. And when I described them accurately large aquatic rodents with flat tails, she looked disappointed and said she'd imagined them more romantic. Penelope dissolved into laughter, pressing her hand to her mouth to muffle the sound. When she recovered, her eyes were bright with tears of mirth. Romantic beavers. That's remarkable. What are you reading? Marcus nodded toward the book, genuinely curious. She held it up so he could see the cover. The Lewis and Clark Journals. I've read it 3 times. My uncle thinks it's unladylike to be interested in such things, but I can't help it. The idea of seeing landscapes no European has mapped, meeting people living as they have for thousands of years, discovering plants and animals unknown to science. She paused, seeming to catch herself again. I'm rambling. My apologies. Don't apologize, Marcus said firmly. I've spent 2 hours listening to people discuss the weather and gossip about people I don't know. Ramble all you want about the corpse of discovery. What followed was the most engaging conversation Marcus had experienced in years. Penelope's knowledge of Western exploration was encyclopedic, but she wore it lightly, asking him questions that revealed both her intelligence and her awareness of what books couldn't teach. She wanted to know about the native tribes he'd encountered, how they lived, what they believed, how they viewed the encroaching wave of white settlement. She asked about the landscape itself, whether the Great Plains really stretched endlessly, whether the Rocky Mountains truly looked like walls of stone thrust from the earth by angry gods. Marcus found himself describing the Shoshone camp where he'd wintered during a particularly brutal season, the kindness of the chief who'd shared food when Marcus's supplies ran low. He told her about dawn breaking over the Tetons, painting snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold. He described tracking a grizzly for 3 days through high country, not to kill it, but simply to observe its behavior. You let it live? Penelope asked, clearly surprised. I wasn't hunting for food or pelts, Marcus explained. I was just curious. The wilderness isn't a resource to be extracted, Miss Ashford. It's a living thing, and we're guests in it, though most white men seem to have forgotten that. That's a remarkably enlightened view, she said softly. Most accounts I've read treat the frontier as empty space waiting to be conquered and civilized. Then they're written by people who've never actually been there, Marcus said, or who went with their eyes closed. Time slipped away unnoticed. They talked about the decimation of beaver populations, the moral complexities of the fur trade, the tension between wanting to preserve wilderness and needing to earn a living from it. They discussed the Missouri River's spring floods, the varieties of elk in different mountain ranges, the meaning of place names in Shoshone and Lakota. It wasn't until a servant appeared to announce that supper was being served that Marcus realized 2 hours had passed. He stood reluctantly, offering his hand to help Penelope rise. Her hand was warm in his, and he was struck by how comfortable this had felt, not the charged, performative flirtation happening inside, but genuine human connection. "Thank you," Penelope said quietly. "This was the best part of my evening." "Mine as well," Marcus admitted, "though I suppose we should return before your uncle sends a search party." They walked back toward the ballroom together, the spell of their conversation slowly dissolving as the noise and light grew closer. At the threshold, Penelope hesitated. "You'll be expected to mingle with the other young ladies," she said, not looking at him. "It's fine. You don't need to. I understand this was just a pleasant conversation, nothing more." Marcus wanted to argue, but before he could formulate a response, Caroline Whitmore materialized like a silk-clad specter, linking her arm through his with practiced ease. "Mr. Dalton, we've all been wondering where you disappeared to. You simply must try the pheasant. It's divine." She steered him away with the determination of a sheepdog herding a stray, chattering about menu selections and table arrangements. Over her golden head, Marcus watched Penelope slip back into the shadows near the library doors, retrieving her book and settling into her alcove like a bird returning to its nest. Something about the resignation in her posture bothered him deeply. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and increasingly transparent attempts at seduction. Caroline Whitmore dominated much of his attention, her mother hovering nearby with approval gleaming in her eyes. She was undeniably beautiful, accomplished at all the social graces, and clearly interested in becoming Mrs. Marcus Dalton. She was also, Marcus realized with growing certainty, one of the most tedious people he'd ever met. "Of course, Father says the Western Territories are terribly primitive," Caroline was saying, one hand resting possessively on his forearm. "I can't imagine why anyone would choose to live in such conditions when civilization offers so much comfort and refinement." "Some people prefer authenticity to refinement," Marcus said evenly. Caroline laughed as though he'd made a joke. "How amusingly gruff you are! I'm sure you don't really mean that. After all, you've returned to proper society now, haven't you? Surely you don't intend to go back to living in some crude cabin." "Actually, I maintain a home in the Bitterroot Mountains," Marcus said. "I returned to Boston primarily for business matters." Caroline's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "How rustic! But I'm sure that once you settle down properly, you'll prefer the amenities of city life. A wife would certainly help civilize your habits." Marcus glanced across the room to where Penelope sat reading, apparently content in her solitude. She looked up briefly, their eyes met, and she offered a small, knowing smile before returning to her book. In that moment, Marcus understood something fundamental. Caroline saw him as a project to be refined and reshaped. Penelope had simply seen him. The evening concluded with Charles Ashford calling for attention. Gentlemen, he announced, beaming with self-satisfaction, the time has come for you to make your choices. Each of you will select one young lady to pursue a formal courtship. Ladies, you have the right to accept or decline, though I trust you'll all be receptive to these fine suitors. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The young women straightened, expressions shifting to practiced displays of demure availability. Their mothers exchanged significant glances, mental calculations evident on their faces. "We'll proceed in order of arrival," Ashford continued. "Mr. Hartford?" William stepped forward, choosing the daughter of a shipping magnate with clear business motivations on both sides. The process continued, each bachelor selecting a young woman who responded with carefully modulated delight, while their mothers beamed. Finally, Ashford turned to Marcus. "Mr. Dalton, as our guest of honor, the most eligible bachelor present, you have the final choice." Every eye in the room fixed on him. Caroline positioned herself prominently, smile radiant with confidence. Her mother actually winked. Marcus looked at the assembled young women, beautiful, well-bred, accomplished in all the social graces that made them desirable wives, according to society's calculations. Then his gaze found Penelope, still in her alcove, not even pretending to participate. She'd opened her book again, clearly trying to make herself invisible during what she must have anticipated would be a humiliating moment. He thought about their conversation on the veranda, her genuine interest, her sharp intelligence, the way she'd made him laugh. How comfortable he'd felt speaking with her about things that actually mattered. Marcus walked across the ballroom, his boots clicking on the polished floor. The crowd parted, assuming he was approaching Caroline. Instead, he stopped in front of Penelope's alcove. She looked up, confused as he extended his hand. "Miss Ashford," he said clearly, "would you do me the honor of accepting my courtship?" The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Penelope stared at him, her book sliding from her lap. What? "I'm choosing you," Marcus said simply, "if you'll have me." "Are you mocking me?" Penelope whispered, her face flushing with shame and anger. "Is this some cruel joke?" "No joke," Marcus said firmly. "You're the only real person I've met tonight, the only one who talked to me like I'm more than a bank account with legs. I'd like to know you better, if you're willing." Behind him, he heard Caroline's sharp intake of breath, followed by her mother's outraged sputter. Someone, probably Caroline herself, stormed from the room, heels striking the floor like hammer blows. Charles Ashford's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally calculation as he recognized the potential advantage in having Marcus Dalton actually interested in his niece. "Well," he said loudly, recovering his composure, "how delightful. Penelope, my dear, what do you say?" Penelope's eyes searched Marcus's face, looking for deception or pity. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because slowly, tremulously, she placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said softly, "I accept." Marcus helped her to her feet, noting how she trembled slightly. On impulse, he leaned closer and murmured, "You don't have to be afraid. I meant what I said." "Why?" she whispered back. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who asked me about beavers and meant it," he said, making her laugh despite her obvious anxiety. The remainder of the evening passed in a daze of congratulations and barely concealed shock. Several guests left early, including the Whitmores, who departed in what could only be described as high dudgeon. Others lingered, clearly hoping to understand Marcus's unexpected choice. When the event finally ended, Marcus found William regarding him with an expression of mingled amusement and concern. "That was either brilliant or monumentally stupid," William said. "Caroline Whitmore's father controls half the textile mills in Massachusetts, and he'll keep doing business with us because it's profitable," Marcus said. "I'm not marrying someone to secure a contract, William." "No," William agreed slowly, studying his partner's face. "You're not. I've known you 8 years, Marcus, and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at that girl tonight." Marcus didn't respond, but he couldn't entirely suppress a smile. The courtship period that followed was unlike anything Penelope had imagined. She'd spent years watching other young women navigate the intricate dance of proper romance, carefully chaperoned visits, exchanges of poetry and flowers, stilted conversations in parlors while parents lurked nearby. Marcus ignored virtually all of those conventions. Their first official outing occurred 3 days after the matchmaking event. Penelope had expected a carriage ride through Boston Common, or perhaps tea at a respectable establishment. Instead, Marcus arrived at her uncle's house in rough trail clothes, leading 2 horses. "Can you ride?" he asked without preamble. Yes," Penelope stammered, glancing at her uncle, who looked torn between propriety and the desire to keep Marcus interested. "Good. Dress for the outdoors. We're going to the woods." An hour later, Penelope found herself mounted on a gentle mare, following Marcus through the forest outside Boston. They rode for an hour before he stopped at a clearing beside a stream. "This is one of my favorite places near the city," Marcus said, dismounting. "Reminds me of streams in the Rockies, though obviously smaller." They sat on sun-warmed rocks while the water burbled past. Marcus unpacked a simple lunch bread, cheese, apples, and they ate in comfortable silence before the conversation picked up where it had left off on the veranda. Penelope found herself relaxing in a way she never had during formal social interactions. Marcus didn't expect her to perform or pretend. He asked her opinions and actually listened to the answers. When she mentioned her interest in botany, he showed her 3 different types of moss growing near the stream, explaining how mountain men use them for everything from wound dressing to fire starting. "You're not like other men I've met," Penelope said, then immediately regretted the observation. "I'm sorry. That was presumptuous." "It's accurate," Marcus said. "I'm not like them because I haven't been shaped by the same experiences. 15 years in the wilderness changes a person. You stop caring about things like whose family has the oldest bloodline or who wore the most expensive dress to which ball. You care about whether someone can be trusted, whether they tell the truth, whether they see the world clearly or through a veil of comforting lies." "And you think I see the world clearly?" "I think you're trying to," Marcus said, "which is rarer than you might imagine." Over the following weeks, their courtship developed its own rhythm. Marcus took Penelope to museums where they discussed natural history. They visited the harbor, where he taught her to identify ships by their rigging. They attended a lecture on Western exploration, then spent 3 hours afterward arguing companionably about the speaker's conclusions. What they didn't do was attend social events or visit fashionable establishments. Marcus showed no interest in parading Penelope before Boston society, which suited her perfectly. For the first time in her life, she felt seen for herself, rather than judged against impossible standards of beauty and grace. "I don't understand what's happening," she confessed to her uncle one evening. "Why does he keep choosing to spend time with me?" Charles regarded his niece thoughtfully. He'd been surprised by Marcus's choice initially, but watching them together had illuminated something he'd never quite noticed about Penelope. She was interesting, not in the ways society typically valued in women, but in ways that clearly captivated a man who'd spent half his life in the wilderness. "Perhaps," Charles said carefully, "because you're exactly what he needs. Marcus Dalton is a wealthy man, Penelope, but he's also profoundly lonely. He doesn't fit in civilized society, and he knows it. With you, he doesn't have to pretend." "But what about love?" Penelope whispered. "Respect and companionship are valuable, but—" Charles smiled. "My dear girl, have you not noticed the way he looks at you?" She hadn't, actually, or rather, she'd noticed but convinced herself she was misinterpreting it. Marcus was kind to her, enjoyed her company, but surely that didn't mean. The revelation came during their 6th week of courtship. They'd ridden to a lake north of the city, where autumn colors blazed across the surrounding hills. Marcus had been teaching her to skip stones, laughing when her throws sent them plunking straight down instead of dancing across the surface. "You're thinking too hard," he said, moving behind her to adjust her stance. "Feel the weight of the stone. Let your body remember the motion." His hands guided her arm through the proper arc. Penelope was intensely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his body against her back, the strength in his hands. When he stepped away, she felt suddenly cold despite her heavy cloak. She threw the stone. It skipped once, twice, 3 times before sinking. "Better!" Marcus exclaimed. "You're a natural." Penelope turned to thank him and found his expression had shifted. He was looking at her the way she'd caught him looking several times before, with an intensity that made her breath catch. But this time, he didn't look away. "Penelope," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "Yes?" "When I agreed to attend that matchmaking event, I had no intention of actually courting anyone. I was there purely as a favor to William, planning to endure the evening and forget about it. Meeting you changed everything." "Marcus, let me finish," he said, moving closer. "I've spent half my life alone in the wilderness because I never found anyone I wanted to share it with. Every woman I met in civilized society seemed like they were playing a role, performing a script someone else had written. But you—" He reached up, gently cupping her face with one calloused hand. "You're genuine. You're curious and intelligent and brave enough to be yourself. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me want to build a real life with someone, not just survive alone." "I'm not beautiful," Penelope whispered, years of insecurity rising up. "I'm not graceful or accomplished. There are dozens of women who would make better wives by any reasonable standard." "You're wrong," Marcus said firmly. "You're beautiful to me not despite who you are, but because of it. And I don't want a wife who's accomplished at needlepoint and vapid conversation. I want a partner, someone who'll challenge me and teach me and stand beside me as an equal. I want you, Penelope, just as you are." He kissed her then, gentle but unmistakable. Penelope's first kiss, happening beside a lake under October skies, tasting of apples and hope. When they broke apart, she was crying. "Are those happy tears?" Marcus asked anxiously. "Confused tears," Penelope admitted. "I don't understand how this happened. 2 months ago, I was convinced I'd never marry, that no one would ever want me. Then we were both fools, Marcus said, because I was convinced the same thing about myself. We were both wrong, Penelope. We just needed to find each other. 3 weeks later, Marcus proposed. They'd ridden to the stream where they'd had their first outing, and he'd led her to a flat rock that jutted over the water. "I don't have a diamond ring," he said, pulling something from his pocket. "I know I should have bought something impressive from a jeweler, but—" He opened his hand, revealing a small stone, roughly heart-shaped, polished smooth by water. "I found this in a stream in the Bitterroots 2 years ago. Carried it with me because something about its shape pleased me. I didn't know why at the time, but now I do. I was waiting to give it to you." Penelope took the stone, feeling its weight and warmth. It wasn't worth anything in monetary terms, but the gesture behind it was worth more than all the diamonds in Boston. "This isn't worth anything to others," Marcus continued, "but it's perfect just like you. Penelope Ashford, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said through tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in a small ceremony 6 weeks later. No grand society wedding, just family and a handful of close friends in Charles Ashford's parlor. Penelope wore a simple cream dress, no veil, her hair loosely bound with wild flowers Marcus had picked that morning. Caroline Whitmore, she heard later, had married a railroad executive within 3 months, a calculated match that seemed to satisfy everyone except possibly the bride, who already appeared brittle and unhappy in the few times Penelope glimpsed her in town. Marcus and Penelope honeymooned by traveling west, an unconventional choice that scandalized Boston but delighted the bride. They took a steamboat up the Hudson, then traveled by stage and horseback through the frontier territories Marcus knew so well. Penelope saw the Great Plains for the first time, experienced the overwhelming vastness that no book could adequately describe. Marcus taught her to identify animal tracks, to read the weather in cloud formations, to move quietly through forest and meadow. She was clumsy at first, city-bred and uncertain, but she learned with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. They spent 2 weeks in a cabin near the Bitterroot Mountains, the place Marcus considered his true home. It was simple, one large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, but Penelope loved it immediately. "This feels real," she said, standing in the doorway and looking out at mountains that seemed to touch the sky. "Everything else feels like play acting, but this is real." "This is where I want to live," Marcus said, coming to stand beside her. "Not year-round, the business requires me to travel, but this is home. Can you be happy here?" Penelope turned to face him, taking both his hands. "I can be happy anywhere with you, but yes, I think I'll love it here." Their marriage developed depths Penelope hadn't anticipated. Marcus was tender and patient, teaching her about physical intimacy with the same care he showed when teaching her wilderness skills. She discovered that her body, which she'd been taught to view as shameful, wrong, inadequate, could be a source of pleasure and connection. More than that, she discovered partnership. When they returned to Boston the following spring, Marcus began including Penelope in his business dealings. Her mathematical skills proved invaluable for tracking accounts and calculating profits. Her organizational abilities helped streamline operations that Marcus had managed haphazardly for years. "You're better at this than I am," Marcus admitted one evening, watching her create a system for tracking inventory across multiple trading posts. I'm better at the bookkeeping, Penelope corrected. You're better at negotiating with suppliers and understanding market conditions. We complement each other. Within a year, the business's profits had doubled. William Hartford privately told Marcus it was the smartest business decision he'd ever made, hiring Penelope as an informal partner. Marcus always corrected him. She's not an employee. She's my wife and equal partner. But their greatest challenge came during their second year of marriage. Penelope became pregnant, a development that filled them both with joy and anxiety. The pregnancy was difficult, she was often ill, and her body struggled with the demands placed on it. "I'm afraid," she admitted one night, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Women die in childbed, Marcus. Fat women especially, the doctors say, were not built for it." Marcus held her close, feeling helpless in a way he never had when facing grizzlies or blizzards. "You're the strongest person I know," he said, "and I'll be right here beside you." The birth was long and arduous. For 20 hours Marcus sat outside the bedroom where a midwife and doctor worked, praying to a God he wasn't certain he believed in. "Please," he thought desperately, "don't take her from me, not now, not when I've finally found someone who makes life worth living." When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Marcus nearly collapsed with relief. Moments later, the midwife emerged, smiling. "A healthy boy," she announced, "and your wife is tired but well. You can go in." Marcus found Penelope propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. When she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, he saw in her expression everything he felt: wonder, gratitude, overwhelming love. "Meet Thomas," she whispered, "after your father." Marcus sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at his son's wrinkled face. The baby had Marcus's gray eyes and Penelope's dark hair. He was perfect. "Thank you," Marcus said hoarsely, "for this, for everything." Over the following years, 2 more children joined their family, a daughter named Charlotte and another son, James. The cabin in the Bitterroots expanded to accommodate their growing family, though they still spent winters in Boston for business and the children's education. Penelope discovered she loved frontier life as much as Marcus did. She learned to garden in mountain soil, to preserve food for long winters, to teach her children both book learning and wilderness skills. The children grew up bilingual, learning Shoshone from their father's friends in the native tribes, understanding that the world was larger and more complex than Boston society acknowledged. Meanwhile, in Boston, the Daltons became quietly influential. Marcus's business continued to grow, but he insisted on fair dealings with the native trappers, ensuring they received equitable prices for their furs. Penelope used her position to advocate for education access, particularly for girls from poor families. One autumn evening in 1843, 20 years after that fateful matchmaking event, a visitor arrived at their Boston townhouse. The butler announced her with evident reluctance. "Mrs. Caroline Morrison to see you, ma'am." Penelope looked up from where she'd been reviewing accounts with Thomas, now 17, and showing signs of his father's business acumen. Caroline Morrison formerly, Whitmore had married 3 times, each marriage ending in scandal and financial disaster. Her once golden beauty had faded into brittle hardness, and Boston society, which had once celebrated her, now whispered about her behind gloved hands. "Should I send her away?" the butler asked quietly. Penelope considered. She remembered the girl who had mocked her, who had assumed Marcus would be hers by right of beauty and social position. She could turn her away now, a petty revenge for old humiliations. But looking at her son raised to value kindness over cruelty, compassion over competition, Penelope made a different choice. "Show her in," she said. "Thomas, would you excuse us?" Caroline entered hesitantly, clearly expecting hostility. She'd aged poorly, worry and disappointment etching lines around her mouth and eyes. Her dress, though still fashionable, had seen better days. "Mrs. Dalton," Caroline said stiffly, "thank you for seeing me. I didn't know where else to go." "Please, sit," Penelope said gently. "Would you like tea?" Over the next hour, Caroline's story emerged haltingly. 3 marriages to men who'd seemed promising, but proved either cruel, profligate, or dishonest. Loss of her inheritance through bad investments and worse choices. Estrangement from her family, who blamed her for bringing shame on their name. "I heard you manage your husband's business," Caroline said finally, not meeting Penelope's eyes. "That you're known for being fair. I wondered if there might be any position, anything at all, I can work. I'm not too proud anymore." Penelope studied the woman who had once represented everything she'd envied and feared. Caroline had been beautiful, confident, certain of her value and her future. Now she sat broken and desperate in Penelope's parlor, asking for help from the woman she'd pitied and dismissed. "I can offer you a position as clerk in our Boston office," Penelope said slowly. "It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, and you'll be treated fairly. If you prove reliable, there are opportunities for advancement." Caroline's head snapped up, shock evident in her face. "Why would you help me, after how I treated you?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Penelope said simply. "Because I remember what it felt like to be dismissed and underestimated. Because holding grudges is exhausting, and I prefer to spend my energy building rather than destroying." Caroline left with an employment contract and something that looked like hope in her eyes. When Marcus returned that evening, Penelope told him about the encounter. "You're too kind," he said, though his tone suggested admiration rather than criticism. "I'm practical," Penelope corrected. "Forgiveness is lighter than revenge, and besides, she might actually be good at the work. We need another clerk." Marcus pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Have I mentioned lately that choosing you was the smartest decision I ever made?" "Not in the past 3 hours," Penelope teased. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd changed your mind." "Never," Marcus said firmly. "I chose you then. I choose you now. I'll choose you every day for the rest of our lives." That night, lying beside her husband in the darkness, Penelope thought about the unlikely path that had brought them together, a matchmaking event designed to forge profitable alliances. 20 beautiful women competing for wealthy husbands. A fat girl in a corner with a book, convinced she'd never be chosen, and a mountain man who'd seen past all the performances and pretense to recognize something genuine and rare. She'd spent years believing her body made her unlovable, her interests made her strange, her intelligence made her unmarriageable. Marcus had taught her that all those things she'd viewed as flaws were actually strengths, at least, to someone willing to look beyond society's narrow definitions of value. Their children were asleep in nearby rooms. Their business thrived through hard work and integrity. Their marriage had weathered challenges and grown stronger for it. And tomorrow, They'd rise and do it all again, building a life together that honored both of them, that made space for wilderness and civilization, that proved love could bloom in unexpected places if people were brave enough to choose authenticity over appearance. Marcus had chosen her. But more importantly, Penelope had chosen him back, had been brave enough to believe his choice was real, to trust that she deserved love, to build a partnership based on genuine respect and affection. 20 beautiful women had been ignored that night, but the one everyone else had ignored had found everything she'd never dared to hope for, not because she'd changed herself, but because she'd found someone who valued exactly who she was. And that, Penelope thought as sleep claimed her, made all the difference.